Well, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, says now is the best and possibly the last chance for a deal between Israel and Hamas that secures a ceasefire and the release of Israeli hostages. The Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, described a meeting with Antony Blinken in Jerusalem earlier today as being positive. Well, earlier I spoke to Danielle Bett, who is Director of Communications at Yachad, UK, a British Jewish campaign group who advocate a political resolution to the conflict. I started by asking if she agreed with Secretary Blinken that this is the best and last time to secure a deal.
It's difficult to say if it's the best chance, as it's difficult to feel hopeful when we've had so many cycles of these negotiations fail. But it does very much feel like there is more pressure than ever on the Israeli government and Hamas from international partners to reach a deal, because we really are on the cusp of regional escalation. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire. We still have over 100 hostages, Israeli hostages, being held by Hamas in Gaza. And so if this deal isn't reached, more lives are it's going to cost more lives. So it really feels like it's more pressing than ever, and that more work is being done by the international community than before.
Okay. Why do you feel like he feels that way, if that makes sense? Or perhaps why would he say that? You know, whether he feels that way or not, you know, clearly he has seen some diplomatic advantage in describing it in such urgent terms.
Yeah, I'm assuming that I'm obviously not privy to the detail of the negotiations, but I'm assuming that there is signaling from both Hamas in Gaza and its international allies, like in Qatar and other places, as well as from the Israeli government, that there is actually a chance of a deal being reached. There's immense pressure from the Israeli public, for quite some time now for a deal to be reached. And so that's also been building up. And it's in the best interest of both Israelis and Palestinians for this war to end and for regional escalation to be prevented. And so it does feel like the parties are more engaged than perhaps they were before.
Right, okay. And just bring us to tonight, Danielle, because you have been at a protest outside Antony Blinken's accommodation, haven't you, in Tel Aviv?
Yeah, I actually stumbled upon it by chance, but outside of Secretary Blinken's hotel in Tel Aviv, there was a fairly spontaneous protest. There are protests across Israel every single week to end the war and to release all the hostages. So people were calling for a ceasefire to happen now. These are ordinary Israelis, as well as hostage families, hostage loved ones who want to see this war ending and who want to see as many hostages as possible being saved. And so it's really quite a desperate cry from people to do everything they possibly can to show Blinken that he has the support of ordinary Israelis.
Right, okay, that's interesting, because I was trying to figure out what a protest outside Antony Blinken's residence would be aimed at, whether that would be aimed at a criticism of Antony Blinken or trying to show support for Antony Blinken, as he presumably does more than anybody at the moment to try to bring about what they want.
Yeah, it's not critical of him at all. They're very critical of the Israeli government and very unhappy with how the Israeli government has handled the negotiations so far. Many believe that Netanyahu has stopped previous deals from happening and has therefore not allowed hostages to be released. So actually it's a call for support and a cry for help from the US government to do all it can to ensure that a deal is secured, because many Israelis don't have faith that the Israeli government can or wants to achieve a negotiated deal, and so they're turning to American partners in hope that they can help. Right,
I see. And you mentioned there, I mean, there is clearly deep dissatisfaction with Benjamin Netanyahu everywhere from, the protests on the streets of London to the White House to the streets of Israel. It does feel as though there is a coalition of people who are dissatisfied and angry with the way that Benjamin Netanyahu has handled this moment of history. How do you reflect on that, Danielle, and the role that you think it is playing in the effort to bring about peace?
I think that Netanyahu is vastly unpopular with a lot of people in the Israeli public. Surveys have shown that for quite some time. I think that we're at a very different point than we were at the start of this war in October, November, December, where it felt like a very defensive war, whereas now it's become clearer and clearer that aims haven't been set out for where this war is going, for why we're fighting it, and for what we aim to achieve or how we end it, nor on how long-term security is achieved. And so people are very frustrated and angry that we've been dragged into this never-ending war with no clarity on what the long-term outcomes are meant to be. And most of all, what people are frustrated with is the fact that there's been a failure to engage properly with hostage families and also to release hostages, which to many of us, that should be the first priority, is saving Israeli lives people who are being ordinary citizens being held hostage by Hamas. And so that is a major frustration. Also, I will say that surveys do show that most Israelis do not support this government and do not support this war.
Okay, so that's very interesting. And I wonder if we could deal with those who will feel a sense of frustration, Danielle, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the role of the Israeli government and all that sort of stuff, but whose frustration doesn't extend to an appetite for a political solution that involves effectively a negotiation with a terrorist organisation in Hamas, who will say, actually, for all of the faults, there is an end here, which is the deconstruction of Hamas as a force, the bringing back of the hostages through force in Gaza, and that those are the right aims of the Israeli government, and that to negotiate with a terrorist organisation is beyond the pale.
Well, we've negotiated with terrorist organizations for quite some time now because Hamas is the organization on the border in Gaza. And so we've had no choice. Benjamin Netanyahu and his governments have also been instrumental in ensuring that funds have been transferred with the help of Qatar to Hamas. And so I think that we can't pretend that the talks with Hamas are something that started just with this war. And they've taken our citizens hostage, so we have no choice but to negotiate with them. And also the reality is that if we want to have long-term peace, we have to strengthen other partners in Palestine and beyond that in the region to ensure that we have a better partner for long-term peace resolutions than Hamas, which would be the opposite of what the current government's has to offer.
Right, and presumably those would say, some people would say, Danielle, that is defeating Hamas. That's, there is no peace for Israel with a terrorist in their back garden.
Well, yes, exactly, and for both Israelis and Palestinians, we need to have two states who are secure. Most people want to obviously live in peace and security and non-violence, but we have to allow the political conditions for that to happen. And we've been going down the exact opposite route. And Netanyahu's Likud party for quite some time has made it very clear that Hamas is an asset and that the Palestinian Authority, who rule in the West Bank, are a cost or a burden. And so we have to alter the way in which we think about the status quo, and we have to shift the policy so that this isn't something that's going to happen overnight. But if we want in the future for these endless cycles of war to stop, then we have to shift the current reality in the way that we treat it.
But defeating Hamas then could be a military. Well, it would have to presumably be a military defeat of Hamas. It would at least have to be. There are some arguments, Danielle, I guess, about whether you can defeat the ideology at all. But at the very least, you have to deconstruct their infrastructure and what they have, presumably.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And that's why I say also that we are at a very different point than we were at the beginning of this war, where it was a very defensive war. We had to get Hamas physically out of Israeli territory because they had taken over towns on October 7th. We had to reclaim our own territory and resecure a border. However, an idea, as you said, cannot only be defeated through military means, because if it's not Hamas, then it will be Islamic Jihad. And if it's not Islamic Jihad, it will be another organization that grows. And so we have to think about what will encourage Palestinians to engage through diplomacy and through democracy, and that is giving them something better on offer than just Hamas. And I think it's also important to remember that elections haven't been held in Palestine for well over 15 years now, and so most Palestinians living in Gaza are 18 and under, and therefore haven't voted for Hamas and don't want this organization necessarily to be ruling them. And so yes, Hamas has to be defeated, but it will not be defeated through military means alone. We have to look at diplomacy, and we have to look at giving an alternative to the reality on the ground.
That is Danielle Bett, Director of Communications at Yachad UK, a British Jewish campaign group who advocate a political resolution to the conflict in the Middle East.